Blood still stained the floorboards of the Travis farmhouse when Thomas Riddick arrived in Southampton County, Virginia on August 25, 1831. 3 days had passed since Nat Turner's rebellion claimed 55 white lives in what would become known as the deadliest slave uprising in American history. But what Riddick discovered during his 70-day hunt for the surviving rebels would reveal that the official death count was a carefully constructed lie, and the true horror of Turner's revolt went far deeper than anyone dared admit. The authorities had hired Riddick to bring back fugitive slaves, but they never told him he would be hunting men who knew secrets worth killing for, secrets that powerful families in Virginia had buried beneath decades of silence and blood. The carnage that greeted him in those first hours would pale in comparison to what he would uncover about the systematic crimes that had triggered Turner's methodical campaign of justice. Before we continue with the story of Thomas Riddick and his terrifying discoveries in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from America's darkest past. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history seekers. The smell of death hung heavy in the humid Virginia air as Riddick examined the crime scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life, each one revealing patterns that challenged everything the authorities claimed about the rebellion's random nature. Southampton County in 1831 was a patchwork of tobacco plantations and small farms where the Entoway River wound through dense forests and treacherous swamplands that had witnessed more violence than most residents cared to acknowledge. The county's 4,000 residents, split almost evenly between white and enslaved, lived in an uneasy balance that had been maintained through generations of carefully orchestrated fear and brutal repression. This wasn't just another rural Virginia county. It was a powder keg where wealthy planters had grown increasingly paranoid about maintaining control over their human property, often resorting to methods that shocked even their fellow slaveholders. Thomas Riddick had built his reputation as one of Virginia's most effective slave catchers during 15 years of tracking fugitives through the worst terrain the South could offer. At 38 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with the lean build of a man who had spent countless nights sleeping rough in swamps and forests. His weathered face bore scars from encounters with desperate runaways, but his gray eyes held the calculating intelligence that made him successful where other bounty hunters failed. Riddick was known for his methodical approach and his ability to think like his quarry, studying their patterns and motivations until he could predict their next move with uncanny accuracy. What set Riddick apart from other slave catchers was his literacy and his habit of keeping detailed records of his cases. He had taught himself to read and write during his youth as an indentured servant, skills that proved invaluable when tracking became his profession. He maintained careful notes about the families he worked for, the slaves he pursued, and the social dynamics of the communities where he operated. This attention to detail had saved his life more than once when clients tried to cheat him, or when local politics turned dangerous. Riddick had been working the tobacco harvest in neighboring Nansemond County when the first panicked riders arrived with news of the massacre that would change everything. By the time he reached Southampton County on that sweltering August afternoon, the immediate aftermath had already begun to reveal troubling inconsistencies. White militias from as far as North Carolina had descended on the region, conducting house searches and summary executions of any slave who seemed suspicious. The fear was palpable. Women clutched their children and refused to let them out of sight, while men gathered in armed groups, their faces etched with a terror that spoke of more than just the recent violence. What struck Riddick immediately was the selective nature of the destruction he witnessed. These weren't random acts of violence born from desperation or opportunity. The rebels had moved with surgical precision, striking specific homes while deliberately avoiding others that seemed equally vulnerable. They had possessed detailed knowledge of their targets' routines, weaknesses, and the layout of properties they had supposedly never entered. The Travis farm, where the rebellion had begun in earnest, showed signs of careful planning. The family had been caught completely off guard at precisely the moment when they would be most vulnerable, suggesting inside knowledge of their daily habits. The inconsistencies in witness testimony were equally troubling. Some survivors claimed the attackers had been wild and frenzied, while others described them as eerily calm and purposeful. Several witnesses mentioned that the rebels had seemed to be looking for specific items or documents, ransacking studies and bedrooms while ignoring valuable silver and jewelry. Most disturbing of all were reports that some of the attackers had called their victims by name and had made specific accusations before striking, suggesting personal knowledge that field slaves shouldn't have possessed. County officials provided Riddick with a list of 6 fugitive slaves still at large, led by Nat Turner himself. They offered generous bounties, $50 for each captured rebel and an unprecedented $200 for Turner alive. But as Riddick studied the official reports and spoke with surviving witnesses, he began to notice gaps and contradictions that would soon consume his thoughts entirely. The rebellion had supposedly begun at dawn on August 22nd, but several witnesses reported hearing gunshots and screams as early as August 20th, sounds that were dismissed as hunting accidents or slave discipline. More troubling were the gaps in the timeline provided by authorities. The rebels had allegedly covered nearly 20 m in a single day, striking at multiple properties with military precision. Yet the official reports made no mention of how a group of field slaves had acquired such tactical knowledge or coordination. As Riddick set up his base of operations in Jerusalem, the county seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple manhunt for desperate fugitives. On his 3rd day in Southampton County, Riddick made his first disturbing discovery while examining the ruins of the Ree plantation, a sprawling property that had been one of the county's most prosperous tobacco operations. The main house had been burned to the ground with such thoroughness that even the stone foundation showed crack patterns from intense heat, and according to the official report, 5 members of the Ree family had perished in the flames after being overwhelmed by the rebels. But as Riddick sifted through the charred remains with the methodical approach that had made him successful, his trained eye caught something that made his blood run cold, and his hands shake for the first time in years. The bodies hadn't died in the fire. They had been positioned in the house after death, and then burned in a deliberate attempt to obscure the true manner of their deaths. The scorch patterns on the surviving floorboards told a story of accelerants being poured in specific locations to ensure complete destruction of evidence. The placement of personal belongings scattered in patterns that suggested they had been moved after the family's death painted a picture of someone searching for specific items before setting the fire. Most damning of all were the bullet holes Riddick discovered in the stone foundation walls, holes that had been made from inside the house, suggesting the family had barricaded themselves and fought back, contradicting the official narrative of them being caught completely off guard while sleeping. The discovery of a hidden cellar beneath the ruins revealed even more disturbing evidence. The cellar had partially survived the fire, and inside, Riddick found signs of recent occupation, not by the Ree family, but by someone who had been imprisoned there. Iron shackles bolted to the wall still held fragments of cloth and human hair, and the scratches carved into the stone walls told stories of desperation and suffering that no official report had mentioned. The cellar's existence had been carefully concealed from the main house above, accessible only through a hidden entrance that required specific knowledge to locate. That evening, as Riddick questioned neighbors about what they had witnessed during the attack on the Ree property, an elderly slave named Moses approached him in the shadows behind the county courthouse. Moses had worked on the Ree plantation for over 40 years, had somehow escaped the massacre, and bore the physical marks of decades of brutal treatment, scars that told their own story of the Ree family's methods of maintaining discipline. His weathered hands shook, not just from age, but from fear as he handed Riddick a small leather pouch, glancing nervously at the armed patrol passing nearby, and speaking in the careful whispers of a man who had learned that the wrong words could mean death. "Mr. Turner, he leave this for whoever come looking," Moses whispered, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suppressed truth. "Said to tell them that what they done to Master Reese's girl weren't no secret no more. Said the whole county going to know what kind of man Ree really was and what happened to all them children who disappeared over the years." Inside the pouch, Riddick found a collection of items that would forever change his understanding of both the rebellion and the community where it had occurred. There was a child's hair ribbon, once white, but now stained with dried blood that had turned brown with age, suggesting the violence it had witnessed was not recent. A page torn from a family Bible contained certain passages underlined in red ink, verses about justice, retribution, and the sins of the fathers being visited upon their children. Most chilling of all was a daguerreotype of a young girl who bore an unmistakable resemblance to both the Ree family's distinctive features and several of their enslaved workers, her eyes holding a sadness that spoke of knowledge no child should possess. As Riddick studied the photograph by lamplight in his cramped hotel room, Moses provided context that made his stomach turn and his understanding of the rebellion's true nature begin to crystallize. The girl in the image was indeed Reese's own daughter, but not by his wife. She had been born to one of his slaves when she was barely 14 years old. A crime that Ree had covered up by claiming the child was the result of his slave's relationship with another enslaved man on the property. The girl had lived in the main house as a servant until she reached puberty and began to resemble her father too closely to hide the truth. Then she had simply disappeared one night, officially sold to a distant plantation in South Carolina. But the quarters whispered of something far more sinister. The blood-stained ribbon suggested that Turner and his followers had uncovered evidence of her true fate and had used it to justify their actions against the family. The next morning brought news that would escalate Riddick's investigation into dangerous territory and convince him that forces beyond his understanding were at work in Southampton County. Dr. Marcus Blunt, the county physician who had been documenting the rebellion's casualties and who was known for his meticulous record-keeping, was found dead in his study under circumstances that officials quickly labeled a heart attack brought on by the stress of treating so many wounded militiamen. But Riddick arrived at the scene before the body was removed and immediately noticed details that suggested a far more violent end. Defensive wounds on the doctor's hands, overturned furniture that indicated a struggle, and most significantly, an empty safe that had been professionally cracked open using techniques that required specialized knowledge and tools. Dr. Blunt's housekeeper, a free woman of color named Sarah Vaughn, who had worked for the physician for over 15 years, pulled Riddick aside as he examined the study. Her hands trembled as she described how Blunt had been working frantically since the rebellion began, not just treating wounded militia men and documenting casualties, but secretly examining bodies and taking notes that he kept locked away in his safe. The night before his death, he had confided to Sarah that the official casualty reports being sent to Richmond were fabricated, that the true death toll was much higher and included victims that certain powerful families wanted to keep hidden from any investigation. He said some of them bodies he looked at weren't killed by no slave rebellion, Sarah whispered urgently, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had witnessed her employer's growing terror firsthand. Said they'd been dead for days, maybe even weeks, before Mr. Turner ever started his uprising. Dr. Blunt, he was scared like I never seen him scared before, kept saying somebody was using this whole mess to cover up older crimes, much worse crimes than anything the rebels done. The implications of Dr. Blunt's murder sent ripples of paranoia through Southampton County's white community that extended far beyond concern about surviving rebels. As Riddick continued his investigation over the following days, He began to notice that he was being watched by people who clearly weren't local militia or concerned citizens. Well-dressed men appeared at taverns where he took meals, always positioned to overhear conversations, and always disappearing before he could approach them directly. Riders followed him at a distance when he traveled between plantations, maintaining professional surveillance that spoke of training and coordination. Most troubling of all, several witnesses he had planned to interview suddenly became unavailable, claiming illness, family emergencies, or complete loss of memory about events they had previously described in vivid detail. The pattern of intimidation was so systematic that Riddick began to suspect he had stumbled into something that went far beyond a simple slave rebellion in its aftermath. Someone with significant resources and influence was working to control the narrative of what had happened, and they were willing to use violence and coercion to ensure that certain truths never came to light. The realization that he might be in personal danger only strengthened his determination to uncover what Turner and his followers had really discovered about Southampton County's darkest secrets. Undeterred by the growing atmosphere of menace, Riddick decided to focus his search on the Great Dismal Swamp, the vast wilderness where Turner and his remaining followers were believed to be hiding. The swamp stretched across hundreds of square miles of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, a maze of waterways, thick vegetation, and treacherous terrain that had sheltered runaway slaves for generations. If Turner was going to make his final stand anywhere, it would be in this natural fortress that had defeated countless previous attempts at penetration by law enforcement and military forces. The Great Dismal Swamp held a reputation that went beyond its obvious dangers of quicksand, venomous snakes, and disorienting fog. Local folklore spoke of entire communities of escaped slaves who had established permanent settlements deep in the wilderness, creating their own society with its own laws and customs. These Maroons, as they were known, had supposedly developed networks that could move information and supplies across hundreds of miles of dangerous terrain, communicating through methods that authorities had never been able to understand or intercept. On September 15th, nearly 3 weeks after beginning his hunt, Riddick made contact with a network of slave catchers and bounty hunters who had been working the swamp for years. Men who knew every path, every hidden clearing, and every family of Maroons who had established permanent settlements in the wilderness. These professional trackers, led by a grizzled veteran named Captain Isaiah Fletcher, shared intelligence that painted a picture of something far more organized and threatening than a desperate band of fugitives trying to avoid capture. Fletcher, who had worked the Dismal Swamp for 15 years and bore the scars of dozens of encounters with both human and natural dangers, shared information that made Riddick question everything he thought he knew about the rebellion and its aftermath. Fletcher's network had identified at least 3 separate camps of rebels. Each containing more men than the official report suggested was still at large. More disturbing, these camps were being supplied with food, ammunition, and medical supplies by unknown benefactors who clearly had significant resources and were able to move through the swamp with the same ease as the rebels themselves. "This ain't no ordinary slave uprising," Fletcher confided as they prepared for their first foray into the deep swamp, checking weapons and supplies with the methodical care of men who knew that mistakes in the wilderness meant death. "These boys got organization, they got supplies, and they got information about things they shouldn't know nothing about. Word is Turner himself ain't even the real leader no more. There's someone else calling the shots. Someone who knows how to fight a war, and who's been planning this whole thing for a lot longer than anybody wants to admit." Fletcher also revealed that several prominent white families had approached him privately over the past weeks, offering substantial bonuses for specific rebels to be brought back dead, rather than alive, claiming they were seeking justice for lost relatives, but displaying a level of fear that suggested their motivations were more complex and personal. He had noticed that all the families making these requests shared certain characteristics. They had been established in Southampton County for generations. They had accumulated wealth quickly and under circumstances that weren't entirely clear, and they all seemed terrified of what their captured slaves might reveal under interrogation by authorities from outside the county. The deeper Fletcher delved into the details of what he had observed, the more convinced Riddick became that Turner's rebellion wasn't just about slavery and freedom. It was about justice for specific crimes that had been hidden for decades. And the explosive revelation of those crimes would destroy some of Virginia's most respected and influential families. The rebels weren't just fighting for their lives in the swamp. They were protecting secrets that could reshape the entire region's understanding of its own history. As September gave way to October and the weather began to change, bringing morning mists that made the swamp even more treacherous and mysterious, Riddick's pursuit took him deeper into the wilderness and closer to secrets that powerful people were willing to kill to protect. He began to understand that Nat Turner's rebellion wasn't just a historical footnote about slave resistance. It was the climax of a long brewing war between those who wanted the truth exposed and those who would do anything to keep it buried forever. The deeper he ventured into the green hell of the Great Dismal Swamp, the more Riddick realized that he wasn't just hunting fugitive slaves. He was walking into the middle of a conflict that would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether the most horrific crimes imaginable would remain hidden beneath layers of silence and fear. October 1st brought the first direct evidence that Riddick was being hunted as much as he was hunting, and that his investigation had attracted the attention of people who played by rules far more deadly than those governing ordinary criminal pursuit. He discovered his campsite had been searched during the night with a level of professionalism that spoke of military training. Items had been carefully moved and replaced in an attempt to hide the intrusion. But Riddick's habit of setting subtle traps had revealed the violation. Someone with extensive experience in covert operations had gone through his belongings, copied documents, and even taken daguerreotypes of evidence he had collected. The intrusion was so skillful that most men would never have detected it, but Riddick's years of tracking dangerous fugitives had taught him to notice details that others missed. The warning left behind was both subtle and unmistakable. A noose made from hemp rope, the kind used on tobacco plantations throughout Virginia, hanging from a tree branch positioned exactly where Riddick would see it when he emerged from his shelter at dawn. The rope was new, and the knot was tied with the precise technique used by professional executioners, leaving no doubt about the message being conveyed. But rather than intimidating him, the threat only strengthened his determination to uncover the truth, and made him realize that he was closer to something important than he had initially understood. Working with Fletcher's network of informants and trackers, Riddick began methodically mapping the rebel camps and their supply lines, a process that revealed patterns suggesting coordination and resources that extended far beyond anything a group of escaped slaves could have organized on their own. What emerged was a picture of an operation that stretched far beyond Southampton County, involving not just the rebels hiding in the swamp, but a sophisticated network of supporters that included some surprising and dangerous participants. The supply lines told a story that contradicted everything the authorities claimed about the rebellion being an isolated uprising of desperate slaves. The rebels were receiving regular deliveries of food, medical supplies, weapons, and ammunition through routes that demonstrated detailed knowledge of the swamp's geography and the movements of law enforcement. More shocking, some of these supplies were clearly coming from sources within Southampton County itself. Merchants, farmers, and even some government officials who had their own reasons for supporting Turner's cause, or who were being coerced into cooperation through threats or blackmail. The breakthrough that would reshape Riddick's entire understanding of the case came when he finally captured William Porter, one of Turner's original followers, who had been wounded in the initial uprising and was now trying to reach safety in Pennsylvania through the Underground Railroad network. Porter had been shot in the shoulder during the attack on the Whitehead plantation and had been hiding in the swamp for over a month, surviving on supplies provided by the mysterious support network that seemed to anticipate the authorities' every move. Under pressure from Riddick's interrogation and weakened by infection from his untreated wound, Porter revealed information that would haunt the slave catcher for the rest of his life and completely transform his understanding of what had really happened in Southampton County. Turner hadn't selected his targets randomly based on opportunity or proximity. He had been building a methodical case against specific families for over 5 years, documenting crimes that included not just the sexual abuse of enslaved women and children, but murder, theft, conspiracy, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of Virginia's government. Porter explained with growing emotion that Turner could read and write better than most white men in the county, skills he had acquired through years of secret study and practice while maintaining the facade of being an illiterate field hand. Turner had used these abilities to maintain detailed records hidden in various locations throughout Southampton County and beyond, creating a comprehensive archive that documented decades of criminal behavior. These records contained witness testimonies from dying slaves who wanted their stories told, physical evidence that Turner had carefully preserved, and even confessions that he had extracted from perpetrators who believed they were speaking to a simple-minded preacher who would never understand the significance of what they were revealing. Nat weren't no prophet, receiving visions from God. Porter gasped through his pain as Riddick treated his infected gunshot wound with supplies from his medical kit. He was a judge and jury, and that Uprising was his courtroom where he finally got to deliver sentences that had been delayed for years. Every family we visited, every person who died in that rebellion, they had it coming for things they'd done in the dark for years, things that would make you sick if you knew the details. Porter's revelations led Riddick to a hidden cache in an abandoned tobacco barn on the outskirts of the county, a location that Turner had used as one of several storage sites for evidence he had been collecting. Hidden beneath the rotting floorboards, Riddick found a trunk containing the most damning and horrifying evidence he had ever encountered in his career. Inside were daguerreotypes of mutilated slaves, including children whose injuries spoke of systematic torture and sexual abuse that went far beyond the normal brutalities of slavery. Accompanying each photograph were detailed notes describing how the victims had died, who was responsible, and where their bodies had been disposed of to hide the evidence. The trunk also contained bills of sale for slaves who had supposedly been sold to distant plantations, but had actually been murdered to prevent them from testifying about crimes they had witnessed. There were copies of letters between Southampton County planters and slave traders in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah, documenting a conspiracy to eliminate troublesome slaves through false sales that actually ended in their deaths. Most shocking of all were documents proving that some of Virginia's most respected political figures had been taking bribes to ignore or cover up these crimes, creating a network of corruption that extended from the county courthouse all the way to the state capitol in Richmond. But the most significant discovery in the trunk was Turner's personal journal, written in a careful, educated hand, that completely contradicted his public image as an illiterate field slave guided only by religious visions. The entries detailed years of methodical observation and investigation, describing how Turner had used his reputation as a preacher to move freely between plantations, gathering intelligence and building cases against the families that would eventually become his targets. He had documented a network of violence and corruption that reached into some of Virginia's most prominent families, including government officials, judges, and even ministers who had been covering up crimes in exchange for political support, financial compensation, or simply to protect their own involvement in the conspiracy. The journal revealed that Turner had been far more than a religious leader or a rebel. He had been conducting the most comprehensive criminal investigation in Virginia's history, using methods that were decades ahead of their time and gathering evidence that could have sent dozens of powerful men to the gallows if it had ever been presented in an honest court of law. Armed with Turner's explosive documentation and finally understanding the true scope of what he had uncovered, Riddick began to comprehend why so many powerful people wanted the remaining rebels dead, rather than captured alive for interrogation. The evidence in that trunk could destroy dozens of families, topple Virginia's political establishment, and potentially trigger a federal investigation that would expose corruption networks spanning multiple states. But as he prepared to transport the materials to Richmond for examination by state authorities, Riddick made a chilling discovery that would force him to question whether anyone in Virginia's government could be trusted with such dangerous information. On October 20th, Sheriff James Epps, who had been coordinating the official manhunt for Turner and presenting himself as a dedicated law enforcement officer, approached Riddick with an unusual and increasingly suspicious request. APS claimed that state investigators from Richmond were arriving soon and that all evidence collected during the pursuit needed to be properly cataloged and secured before their arrival. But Riddick noticed that EPS seemed far more interested in certain documents than others, asking specific questions about what Riddick had discovered and who else might have seen the materials, while showing remarkably little interest in information that could help locate the remaining fugitives. The sheriff's behavior triggered alarms that Riddick's years of dealing with dangerous and deceptive people had taught him to recognize. APS was asking the wrong questions, showing knowledge he shouldn't have, and displaying a level of anxiety that suggested personal involvement rather than professional concern. Most telling of all, Epps repeatedly asked what Riddick had shared with outsiders, whether he had sent any reports to authorities in other states, and what his plans were for the evidence he had collected. Questions that made it clear the sheriff was more concerned with controlling information than with pursuing justice. That night, Riddick's hotel room in Jerusalem was broken into by professional thieves who demonstrated skills that went far beyond ordinary burglary. They had picked the lock without leaving scratches, moved through the room without disturbing items that would have made noise, and ransacked his belongings while leaving valuable watches, money, and weapons completely untouched. The intruders had known exactly what they were looking for and where to find it, confirming that someone with access to official information had directed their search. Fortunately, Riddick's paranoia had led him to hide the most damaging documents in multiple locations throughout the county. But the violation of his temporary sanctuary made it clear that nowhere in Southampton County was safe from the conspiracy he was investigating. The next morning brought news that escalated the situation to a level of violence that made it clear how far the conspirators were willing to go to protect their secrets. Captain Isaiah Fletcher was found murdered in the swamp under circumstances that spoke of professional execution rather than random violence. His body showed signs of systematic torture. Burns, cuts, and broken bones that indicated someone had tried to extract information from him before killing him. Fletcher's network of informants and fellow trackers had scattered to the wind overnight, leaving Riddick completely alone in hostile territory where he could trust no one, and where his every move was being monitored by people who would kill him without hesitation if he threatened their interests. But Turner wasn't finished revealing his hand or demonstrating the sophistication of his long-term planning. On October 25th, broadsides appeared simultaneously throughout Southampton County and in neighboring communities. Crude printed sheets that contained excerpts from Turner's evidence, distributed through a network that had clearly been established long before the rebellion began. Someone with access to printing presses and distribution networks was systematically releasing proof of the planters' crimes to anyone who could read, creating panic among the white population and providing inspiration and hope to the enslaved community. The broadsides included names, dates, and specific accusations that could be verified by anyone willing to investigate, making them far more dangerous than simple propaganda. They contained details about murders that had been covered up, children who had been sold or killed to hide evidence of sexual abuse and financial crimes that had enriched certain families while impoverishing their neighbors. Most damaging of all, they included information about government officials who had been bribed to ignore or cover up these crimes, creating a crisis of confidence in the entire legal system. The appearance of these documents triggered a vicious crackdown that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy Riddick was investigating. Militias began conducting house-to-house searches, not just for rebels, but for anyone possessing copies of Turner's accusations. Several free blacks and poor whites were arrested on suspicion of distributing the materials, and rumors spread that anyone found with the broadsides would be charged with conspiracy to incite insurrection, a capital offense that could be prosecuted without the normal legal protections. The severity of the response only confirmed that the accusations contained in Turner's evidence were accurate, and that powerful people were desperate to prevent their exposure. Riddick realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in American history. A slave rebellion that had transformed into an information war, where the written word was being used as effectively as guns and axes to attack the foundations of the social order. Turner and his mysterious allies were proving that knowledge could be more dangerous than violence, and that the truth, properly documented and strategically revealed, could destroy systems of oppression that had seemed unshakable. But as the authorities grew more desperate to contain the damage and more willing to use extreme measures to silence anyone who threatened the established order, Riddick found himself caught between multiple factions, each willing to kill to achieve their objectives. The manhunt for Turner had become secondary to a larger battle over who would control the narrative of what had happened and what would be allowed to become part of the historical record. Just when we thought we understood the scope of Turner's rebellion, the horror in Southampton County intensifies beyond anything we could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills and making you question what other secrets might be hidden in our nation's past, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this terrifying tale of secrets, rebellion, and the desperate measures taken to hide truths that could destroy everything people believed about their society. The final phase of Riddick's hunt was about to begin, and it would reveal that Turner's most dangerous weapon wasn't violence or even rebellion. It was the truth itself, and the power of that truth to destroy lives, families, and entire communities that had built their prosperity on foundations of unspeakable crime. October 30th, 131 dawned cold and gray with a morning mist that turned the great dismal swamp into a ghostly landscape where shadows seemed to move independently and sounds carried in ways that made direction and distance impossible to determine. After 70 days of pursuit that had transformed from a simple manhunt into something approaching a personal crusade for justice, Thomas Riddick finally closed in on Nat Turner's final hiding place. The location was a crude but ingenious shelter constructed within the root system of a massive fallen oak tree, camouflaged so skillfully that Riddick would have passed by it completely if not for the intelligence provided by his final remaining informant, a young slave who had grown tired of living in constant fear and wanted the whole nightmare to end. But what Riddick found in that hidden sanctuary would forever change his understanding of everything that had transpired since that bloody August morning when the rebellion began. Turner wasn't alone in his refuge, and his companion's presence would transform everything Riddick thought he knew about the nature of the conspiracy he had been investigating. Sitting beside the rebel leader, engaged in quiet but intense conversation over a collection of documents spread between them, was Judge Samuel Rochelle, one of Southampton County's most respected magistrates, and a man whose family had been among the first to settle the region after the Revolutionary War. The sight was so incongruous and unexpected that Riddick initially thought he was witnessing Turner holding a hostage, perhaps using the judge as a bargaining chip for safe passage, or as a human shield against capture. But as he observed the two men through the dense vegetation that concealed his position, it became clear that their relationship was not that of captor and prisoner. They were collaborators, partners in an enterprise that had been years in the making and that had culminated in the most devastating slave rebellion in American history. "Mr. Riddick," Turner said calmly, as the slave catcher finally revealed himself, speaking as if he had been expecting him for days. "Judge Rochelle has been telling me about your investigation and about how close you've come to understanding the truth of what we've accomplished here. We've been wondering when you would finally piece together all the evidence and find your way to us." As Riddick kept his rifle trained on both men, uncertain of the dynamics he was confronting, but knowing that he was in the presence of something unprecedented and dangerous, the full scope of the conspiracy began to unfold through revelations that challenged everything he thought he understood about justice, law, and the nature of rebellion itself. Judge Rochelle wasn't Turner's hostage. He was the conscience, the mysterious white ally who had been helping Turner document and expose decades of criminal behavior among Southampton County's elite families, providing legal expertise, resources, and protection that had made the rebellion possible. "My daughter Sarah," Rel explained with a voice heavy with grief and carefully controlled rage that spoke of years of suppressed fury finally finding expression. She discovered what the Henderson family was doing to their slave children in that hidden basement they thought nobody knew about. When she threatened to expose them and bring charges that would have destroyed their reputation and sent them to prison, they arranged for her to have an accident while riding her horse along the river road. They made it look like she fell and struck her head on the rocks, but I knew they had murdered her to keep their monstrous secret safe. Turner produced a leather satchel that contained the most comprehensive and damaging evidence yet revealed. Documents that proved the existence of a conspiracy among Southampton County's wealthiest and most powerful families to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. The network had included sheriffs, judges, doctors, ministers, and even state officials, all working together to cover up murders, sexual abuse, financial crimes, and corruption that spanned generations, and had claimed hundreds of victims who had been systematically silenced through violence, intimidation, or death. The conspiracy had operated through a system of mutual protection where each family possessed compromising information about the others, creating a web of blackmail and shared culpability that made exposure of any individual crime impossible without bringing down the entire network. They had used their enslaved population not just as property and labor, but as victims of the most depraved violence and experimentation imaginable, secure in the knowledge that their victims could never testify against them in court, and that any evidence of their crimes could be disposed of through murder disguised as sales, accidents, or runaways. But Turner had given those silenced victims a voice through his meticulous documentation and investigation. His rebellion had been carefully planned not as a random uprising of desperate slaves, but as a systematic execution of justice against families that were part of the criminal conspiracy. The seemingly random pattern of attacks had actually followed a precise logic based on years of investigation, evidence gathering, and careful documentation of crimes that demanded retribution. We knew the uprising would fail in terms of creating lasting change. Turner admitted with a calm acceptance that spoke of a man who had made peace with the consequences of his choices. No slave rebellion has ever succeeded in permanently changing the system or creating lasting freedom for our people, but we also knew that 55 dead white people killed in a systematic pattern that couldn't be dismissed as random violence would attract attention from Richmond, from Washington, from newspapers throughout the country, and even in Europe. And once people started asking the right questions and demanding real investigations, all the evidence we had collected would come to light and expose crimes that had been hidden for decades. Judge Rochelle had used his position as a magistrate to ensure that Turner's documentation would survive regardless of the rebellion's outcome. Creating multiple copies and establishing networks that would preserve and distribute the evidence even if both men were captured or killed, he had arranged for materials to be sent to sympathetic judges in other states, to abolitionist newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston, and to federal investigators who specialized in corruption cases involving state and local officials. The rebellion had been as much about publicity and exposure as it had been about direct justice, designed to create a scandal so massive that it couldn't be covered up or dismissed. But the conspiracy to suppress the truth and protect the criminal network went deeper and was more dangerous than either man had anticipated when they began their collaboration. As Riddick listened to their revelations with growing horror and fascination, he began to understand why Dr. Blunt had been murdered with such professional brutality, why Captain Fletcher had been tortured to death in an attempt to extract information about what he had discovered, and why so many powerful people throughout Virginia were willing to risk everything to ensure that Turner and his remaining followers were brought back dead rather than alive. The evidence they had assembled wouldn't just destroy individual families or expose isolated crimes. It would reveal systematic corruption that could bring down Virginia's entire political establishment and trigger federal interventions that would reshape the balance of power. Throughout the South, the network of criminal families had connections that reached into banking, shipping, land speculation, and government contracts, creating a web of financial interests that extended far beyond Southampton County and involved some of the wealthiest and most influential men in America. Turner handed Riddick a final document that represented the culmination of his years of investigation, a comprehensive confession written in his own careful handwriting that detailed not just the crimes he had uncovered, but also the names of everyone who had helped him, the locations of additional evidence caches scattered throughout Virginia and neighboring states, and most importantly, the complete organizational structure of the families who had conspired to use violence, murder, and intimidation to protect their secrets for over 50 years. The document was more than just evidence. It was a complete roadmap for any investigator willing to pursue justice, but also a death sentence for anyone brave enough to act on the information it contained. Turner had created the most comprehensive criminal case in American history, but he had also ensured that anyone who tried to prosecute that case would become a target for elimination by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their interests. "The question now, Mr. Riddick," Turner said, looking directly at the slave catcher with eyes that held both resignation and challenge, "is what you're going to do with what you've learned here today. You can take me back to Jerusalem to be hanged according to the law and let these families continue their crimes for another generation while they use my execution as proof that justice has been served. Or you can be the man who finally brings real justice to Southampton County and helps ensure that the truth we've uncovered reaches the people who have the power and courage to act on it." The choice Turner presented wasn't just about the fate of two men hiding in a swamp. It was about whether the systematic crimes that had defined Southampton County for generations would finally be exposed and punished, or whether they would remain hidden beneath layers of official lies and carefully constructed narratives that protected the guilty while silencing their victims forever. Thomas Riddick made his choice on that cold October morning in the depths of the great dismal swamp. But it wasn't the choice that history would record, and it wasn't the decision that the authorities who had hired him expected or wanted. According to the official reports that were filed with the Virginia government and published in newspapers throughout the country, Riddick captured Nat Turner after a brief but intense struggle and transported him to Jerusalem for trial and execution. The rebel leader was hanged on November 11, 1831, before a crowd of hundreds of spectators who wanted to witness the end of the man who had terrorized Southampton County and challenged the foundations of their social order. But the truth, as Riddick would later document in his private journal, was far more complex and morally challenging than the simple narrative of justice served that satisfied the public's need for closure. Riddick did indeed ensure that Turner faced consequences for his actions, but not in the way that anyone expected, and not through the corrupted legal system that had enabled the crimes Turner had spent years documenting and seeking to expose. Working together with Judge Rochelle over the course of several carefully planned days, Riddick arranged for Turner to be secretly transported to Philadelphia, where he would spend the remainder of his life working with abolitionist organizations, providing testimony for federal investigators, and helping to establish networks that would eventually become part of the Underground Railroad. The man who was hanged in Jerusalem on that November morning was actually William Porter, Turner's wounded follower, who had volunteered to take his leader's place in a final act of loyalty and sacrifice in exchange for safe passage for his own wife and children to freedom in Pennsylvania. The deception was possible because few white residents of Southampton County had ever seen Turner up close enough to identify him with certainty, and those who had were either dead, part of the conspiracy that wanted him silenced, or sympathetic to his cause and willing to participate in the substitution. Porter bore enough physical resemblance to Turner that the switch could be accomplished, especially since the authorities were eager to close the case quickly and restore order to the region before the scandal could spread beyond their ability to control it. The elaborate ruse required careful coordination and significant resources, but Judge Rochelle had been planning for such contingencies for months, establishing connections with abolitionists, sympathetic judges, and even some federal officials who were already suspicious about corruption in Virginia's legal system. The network that had supported Turner during his rebellion continued to function after his supposed capture, ensuring that his work would continue even after his official death. Riddick used his reputation as a successful and trustworthy slave catcher to quietly transport Turner's comprehensive evidence collection to federal investigators in Washington, men who had the authority and resources to pursue the kind of complex corruption case that Turner had been building for years. The resulting investigation would take nearly a decade to complete, but it eventually led to the downfall of several prominent Virginia families, the exposure of corruption networks that reached into multiple states, and the establishment of new legal protections designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished in Southampton County. Many of the planters who had escaped Turner's direct justice during the rebellion found themselves facing federal charges for various crimes ranging from tax evasion and mail fraud to conspiracy and violations of laws governing interstate commerce. Some fled the country rather than face trial, while others were ruined financially by legal costs and the collapse of business relationships built on networks of mutual criminal protection. The exposure of their crimes created a ripple effect that transformed Southampton County's social structure and contributed to the growing national debate about slavery and its moral implications. Judge Rochelle continued to serve as a magistrate for several more years, using his position to ensure that Turner's evidence was preserved and protected while investigations continued. He also worked quietly to establish legal precedents and protections for slaves who reported crimes, though such reforms would take decades to implement fully and would face violent resistance from those who benefited from the existing system. His work helped lay the groundwork for later legal and social changes that would gradually erode some of the worst aspects of the slave system. Though full justice would not come for many generations, the Great Dismal Swamp became a powerful symbol of resistance for enslaved people throughout the South, and stories of Turner's rebellion, embellished and mythologized over time, but retaining their core message about the possibility of fighting back against oppression, spread along the Underground Railroad as proof that justice was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. The swamp continued to shelter runaway slaves and serve as a conduit for those seeking freedom, with Turner's legacy inspiring others to take risks and make sacrifices in pursuit of liberty and dignity. But perhaps the most significant long-term outcome of Riddick's investigation and the revelations it produced was its impact on the national conversation about slavery and the moral foundations of American society. The detailed documentation of crimes committed by Southampton County's elite was eventually published in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, providing concrete evidence that slavery wasn't just economically unjust or morally questionable, but created conditions that enabled and encouraged the most horrific violence, corruption, and abuse imaginable. Turner's evidence became a powerful tool for abolitionists who argued that the institution of slavery corrupted everyone it touched, not just the enslaved, and that the legal and social systems that supported human bondage inevitably became vehicles for the most depraved criminal behavior. The revelations helped shift the national debate from questions about the economic necessity of slavery to moral arguments about the fundamental incompatibility between slavery and civilized society. Thomas Riddick never spoke publicly about what he had discovered during those 70 days in Southampton County, maintaining the fiction that he had simply been a professional slave catcher doing his job and bringing a dangerous fugitive to justice. He retired from bounty hunting shortly after Turner's supposed execution and moved to Ohio, where he lived quietly until his death in 1867, using his savings to purchase a small farm and spending his final years writing detailed journals about his experiences and the moral complexities of the work he had performed. Among Riddick's papers discovered by his descendants years later was a comprehensive account of his investigation that chronicled his growing understanding of the true nature of Turner's rebellion and his gradual transformation from a man who hunted slaves for money into someone who risked everything to ensure that justice was served and truth was preserved. The journal revealed the full scope of what had been uncovered in Southampton County and provided additional evidence that supported the federal investigations that continued long after Turner's supposed death. The journal's final entry, dated November 12, 1831, one day after Turner's supposed execution, captured the moral complexity of what had been accomplished and the ongoing struggle between truth and power that defined American society. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, and sometimes the most important victories are the ones that remain hidden from public view. What we accomplished in Southampton County won't change everything, but it proved that even in the darkest places, truth can survive and eventually find its way to light. The real question isn't whether justice was served, but whether we have the courage to continue serving it when the cost is high and the rewards are uncertain. The legacy of Turner's rebellion and Riddick's investigation would continue to influence American history in ways that neither man could have anticipated. The evidence they preserved, the networks they established, and the precedents they set would contribute to the growing movement that would eventually lead to the Civil War and the formal abolition of slavery. But more immediately, their work demonstrated that individual courage and moral clarity could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression and corruption, creating possibilities for justice, even in circumstances where such possibilities seemed impossible. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, there were individuals willing to risk everything to expose the truth and seek justice for the voiceless and powerless. The story of Nat Turner's rebellion is usually told as a tale of violent uprising and swift retribution, but the evidence suggests that it was actually something far more complex and significant, a carefully planned operation to expose systematic corruption and bring accountability to those who believed themselves above the law and beyond the reach of justice. The revelations that emerge from Southampton County in 1831 remind us that history is often more complicated than the official narratives suggest, and that the most important stories are sometimes the ones that powerful people work hardest to suppress. Turner's rebellion wasn't just about slavery and freedom. It was about the fundamental question of whether truth and justice can survive in a society built on lies and violence, and whether individuals have the courage to pay the price the truth-telling often demands. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed about Turner's rebellion and the conspiracy that surrounded it? Or do you think there are other secrets that remain buried to this day in the swamps and records of Virginia? The evidence suggests that what happened in Southampton County was part of something much larger and more systematic than most people realize, and that the full truth about slavery and its impact on American society is still being uncovered by historians and investigators who are willing to look beyond the comfortable myths we tell ourselves about our past. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this hidden chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that uncover the forgotten truths and buried secrets of our nation's past, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss new content, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries and isn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths about how our society was built. The past has more secrets than we know, and each story we uncover helps us better understand not just where we came from, but who we really are. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the dark corners of American history that most people never learn about in school.